Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Anthropology podcast, where today I'll be interviewing Dr. Will Norman, who is London's Walking and Cycling Commissioner. I was recently at an event in London at UCL on future-proofing anthropology, where we had sort of academics and anthropologists working in industry and for government, kind of coming together with the idea of academics kind of learning from anthropologists to applying what they've learned from anthropology to other kinds of problems and issues in industry and government. So I thought it'd be really nice to have some episodes where we talk to people who have a training in anthropology but are now doing something different. So Will's been in charge of sort of active transport and walking and cycling in London for the last few years under Sadiq Khan, and he's had a really kind of fascinating career since his PhD.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this interview. I think it actually might be one of my favorites, mostly because it kind of challenged my preconceptions of what happens when anthropologists go and work for sort of the private sector or corporations. And I think he worked for, was it Nike?
I think he had a startup to begin with where they were doing social research for a number of different companies. And then, he did some time with Nike and I think the Young Foundation as well.
Yeah, I like the fact that he really showed what he was saying about his time working with Nike. It kind of showed that he could actually have a really positive impact using ethnography and anthropological ways of thinking about things. And I thought, oh, okay. So, maybe we shouldn't be so kind of black and white about these things, about, where we work and what we do and what's good or bad or whatever. So it seems like his work's been really powerful and influential.
Yeah, and just really important as well. And one of the things that comes through the interview is just this fact that, we've really got a kind of culture of transport that revolves around car usage, even in big crowded cities like London. So, and getting people to change their behavior around that, or to even think about changing their behavior is really, really difficult. And he gets a hell of a lot of sort of abuse and sort of difficult interactions as a result of the work that he's trying to do. So I think it's just really interesting from the perspective of kind of thinking about cultural change and how you get people to think about changing their behaviors. But I think he talks really eloquently about that. Anyway, let's get into the episode. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Will Norman to the podcast, who is London's first walking and cycling commissioner, who started in 2016. Will leads the mayor's work to make the capital streets safer for walking and cycling. And Will was previously director of global partnerships at Nike and director of research at the Young Foundation. Will, welcome.
Thanks ever so much, Michael. I'm delighted to be here.
I'd like to start, if you don't mind, by asking you to cast your mind back to your PhD thesis. The third result that comes up when I Googled you was a bit of a hit piece by the right-wing commentator Charlotte Gill, who questions what kind of expertise you might claim to have from a PhD entitled Politics, Migration and Transfrontier Conservation in the Mozambican Villages of the Mozambique-South African Borderland. Could you tell me a little bit about this PhD work and what kinds of skills and sensibilities you developed in the course of this project, which might have then had a bearing on your subsequent career?
Definitely. But thanks. I really am casting my mind back now. So I started doing my PhD in 2000. I was fortunate enough to get a place at LSE. And my PhD, I actually worked in Mozambique at the end of the Civil War for an NGO there, fell in love with the place, found it very interesting, and went back to do some research, really looking at how people in this borderland next to South Africa were caught in, it was a sort of fusion between macro politics between Mozambique and South Africa, how that had shaped their lives through the gold mining industry, migration, how that had changed during the Civil War through apartheid, and then was actually playing out through the lens of a very sort of more contemporary issue of conservation areas and the impact that was having on them. And there isn't an immediate jump between spending 18 months in a mud hut next to the South African border and designing a cycling network for a global city. However, I think there was an awful lot of skills that one picks up during doing anthropology and spending time in places like that. And for me, there were the generic anthropological skills, which I don't think get enough recognition within anthropology, let alone beyond anthropology, in terms of how that can play into careers. But there were some pretty specifics as well. Actually spending some time looking at how politics, local government, NGOs, businesses, communities actually interact. And you can have whatever theories you want written down on bits of paper. You can have whatever Venn diagrams and spreadsheets and plans. Actually, when you immerse yourself in people's lives, you see how complex, how interrelated that is, and what opaque levers of power are being used all the time to drive change or resist change or achieve different outcomes or the outcomes that were planned. And for me, the thing I think I took away most looking back on it with 20, 30 years worth, 20, 25 years worth of hindsight is actually when you're in that melting pot, you begin to realize how complex and how human politics and policy actually is in real life.
Absolutely. And I suppose those kind of opaque levers of power that you talk about must be things that you sort of grapple with in your current job as well, to a certain extent.
Very much on a daily basis. Opaque levers of powers, also personal resilience. If you spend any anthropologist doing field work, whether it's in a contemporary urban setting or a more traditional rural setting, will build quite a resilient nature, a sort of sense of determination, which I think equips everybody for future life, particularly if they're foolish enough to enter into politics.
Absolutely. Well, I spent a lot of my PhD getting up at 4:30 in the morning to go running very long distances, so definitely a bit of resilience there as well.
You beat me hands down.
So I guess to some people, an education in anthropology might seem somewhat esoteric, perhaps even irrelevant in the modern workplace. What kinds of attributes do you think anthropologists working outside of universities can bring to organizations?
Well, I think you've tapped onto something that is a real problem with anthropology on how you communicate those values. The number of people I meet who cannot describe what anthropology offers outside a very niche academic setting, I think is really quite a problem. But if you step back, I think anthropology offers so many different aspects. They've clearly those strong research analytical skills in terms of qualitative research. Ethnography is that key thing that has been increasingly absorbed into so many different aspects of commercial and public policy areas. That critical thinking we all have is anthropology questions the status quo. That's what we do as anthropologists, and that is useful in any setting outside of in any setting, whatever sector you're in. There is clearly an aspect of cultural sensitivity and global awareness that is that shines out of anthropology. It's one of our key pieces, and increasingly that becomes important while navigating, building up that cross-cultural competencies. How do you navigate diversity in a workplace? All of those sort of things are core skills. But we forget some of the things, I think, as anthropologists: communication and storytelling skills. Ethnography is not just a methodology; it is a product, it is a medium, and that is about storytelling. Effective communication of actually, whether that's visual anthropology, writing, all of those. It's key to engage audiences. Now, academics and public policy or media or journalism or whatever, different audiences, but similar stories, particularly when you're dealing with quite complex, qualitative rather than quantitative issues. Telling those stories, framing those debates are really, really important. So I do think that there is and then there is this lack of awareness of how you can then actually, going into a job interview as an undergraduate or have just graduated, what does anthropology mean what does anthropology? People can't articulate this skill. So I think it is very important that all of us have a responsibility to doing that. And you can see how then, it goes beyond human-centered design. The way that anthropology is being used to come up with how human behavior works, user experience in tech, the sort of all of that areas are new areas, which maybe sort of when you look back to Malinowski sitting in the Trobriand Islands, it couldn't be a million miles, you couldn't think further away. But actually, these are the challenges we're facing today. And it comes back down to really understanding people, I suppose, and that is our bread and butter.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I suppose, understanding people from very different places with different perspectives on the world and things, that's becoming, I guess, increasingly important at the moment. It feels like there's increasing amounts of polarization and things.
And then, Michael, the question, why anthropology over any other social science? And I do think that holistic outlook that anthropologists take has something significant to offer. If you're only focused on the economics, if you're only focused on the sociology, if you're only focused on the political, anthropology does take a step back to question that status quo and look how those things interact. And that is actually how people experience life. We don't experience life in silos. It's the easiest way to analyze life in silos, but actually the experience is interconnected, and anthropologists, again, specialize in doing that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So after your PhD, you decided you didn't want to become an academic. You launched your own company to do social research. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the projects that you did with that first company, and perhaps how you applied some of your anthropological training in those projects?
Well, I think let's put this in a bit of better perspective. I'd love to say we launched a company. I finished my PhD, didn't want to be an academic, wondering what on earth I'd done for 4 years, putting this doing and then desperately needing some money and starting doing some random bits of interviewing, random bits of work from essentially my laptop in my bedroom at the time. But with a friend of mine, we really began to realize that some of those skills I just talked about, that storytelling, that ethnography, had real value in terms of a commercial setting. So we set up, at the time, this was in about 2003, 2004, there were a group of us essentially pioneering bringing anthropological methods into more commercial settings. We set up ESRO, it was called then, it's now called Revealing Reality. And that started using ethnography as I said, in a more commercial setting. Now, you can't go and pitch to somebody, I want to spend 18 months studying your product or immersing yourself in those people's lives. So it was much more of a, how would one put it? Sort of, it was a sort of fast and furious ethnographic approach, often doing days in the life of different people. And what we did, we worked for companies like Microsoft, looking at values of software developers at the time. We worked with Nokia, looking at the first range of mobile phones that had video cameras on them. When I tell my kids that, they're astonished that phones used to have video on this. But we also worked in Northern Ireland for looking at how you can create new housing developments and commercial developments that maybe aren't what are the symbols and symbols that sort of make it more of a neutral space rather than being recognized as one of those communities coming out of the peace process. But it was fascinating work, and it often complemented quantitative research. So clearly, companies like Microsoft at the time, Nokia, which again is hard to believe was one of the biggest phone manufacturers in the world, all these companies, Unilever, they do a huge amount of work, but often it was taking people out of the context of their everyday lives, putting them into focus groups, or putting people out of their lives through questionnaires. Now, all of that data is hugely useful. What we did by doing sort of days in the lives in different cultural contexts for these products and processes, we could then start telling these really rich stories, which I think helped often the quantitative data helped reconfirm people's knowledge and views and gave them confidence to do it. Very valuable research. What the innovation, what the sort of ethnographic brought were insights that drove innovation. Little quirky things such as, the fact that software developers that we were spending in some of the big corporate clients were spending their lives outside, going to cinemas that had Wi-Fi so that they could code while watching movies.
Yeah.
It was something why were they doing that? What was the value? Oh, it was in these niche communities where they were seen as valued, far more valued than what they earned in working in a bank or wherever they were. But their what drove them was their sense of identity on these online communities. And then if Microsoft wanted to use that and wanted to understand this group, well, they had to offer something in that community space to be able to feel that their product, that this was something that was driving that ambition. Now, that came out of storytelling, not the quantitative questions. And I think that what ethnographic insights began to yield was a chance to try things differently, think differently, whereas the quant often just reconfirmed or pointed people in a direction that they already knew. And it was that was so fascinating to play with.
Yeah, I think people talk now about flash ethnography. I don't know if that was a term when you were doing it, but that it sounds like that's effectively what you were doing. And it is, I think we often fetishize this idea of going away somewhere for 18 months or 2 years, like you said, Malinowski, idea of being completely sort of detached from things for a really long time. But you can learn a lot in a week, I think, by applying the same sort of sensibilities, absolutely. And I really like what you say about kind of the moments of surprise, the things that surprise you, generate insights that you wouldn't get from other approaches, I think.
Exactly. And one of the things I think is very clear, we employed master's students, PhD students, undergraduates. You don't need a PhD to be an anthropologist. It's a way of thinking, which I think comes through on undergraduate courses and master's courses as much as PhDs in that space. And I think it's all you don't need to have done 18 months abroad to be able to understand some of this stuff. It helps, but it isn't an essential qualification.
Yeah, absolutely. So following that initial work, your focus has been on sort of increasing levels of physical activity and participation in sports around the world, starting with Nike. Can you tell me a little bit about the Nike role and perhaps pick out some specific projects that you worked on and how you approached them with Nike?
Yeah, while we were doing all the commercial work with Edro, it involved a lot of international travel. And like everybody, life moves on, you have kids, and I didn't want to be traveling as much. And I ended up working for a social policy research think tank called the Young Foundation in London. And that worked a lot more with government. Similar thing, using ethnography to tackle complex challenges. And one of the pieces of work we started looking at was health and well-being in young people and the role physical activity, being physically active, played in that. And I started boring someone at a party about this work, and they said, "Oh, you should speak to my friend who works at Nike," and ended up doing some work with Nike initially as a consultant, and then working there as a full-time piece. And it was fascinating. It was such a different context, large global corporate with very strong brand and a household name. I think everybody in the world will know the Nike swoosh and the brand. But what we were looking at was it was a piece of work and a project that started to shift the sort of corporate social responsibility strategy to align it much more with the brand. And essentially, what at the time could Nike stand up as a global force, a sense of responsibility, an organization with purpose. And there were lots of different activities that had been happening that were very good, but didn't really bring it all together. And we reframed all of this as a systems change strategy to focus on physical inactivity. How do we get people more active, especially in kids, for all the health benefits, the mental health benefits, virtually any aspect of people's lives can be improved by being a bit more active. But I think one of the challenges, instead of focusing on small scale projects and individual behavior, what I was interested in is the more systemic shift to how you then build this into broaden environments, how you recognize that this is a societal design issue rather than an individual behavior piece. And once you start looking at it like that, you start thinking, actually, how do we design our schools? How do we design our cities to embed more physical activity and design it into everyday life? So rather than thinking, right, I'm going to run a marathon, how can I walk, encouraging kids to walk to school and having, walking to school, active in school to rethinking how playgrounds are structured, etc., lessons structured, and then after school clubs and walking home afterwards builds in that level of physical activity into kids' lives. Now, we had projects working within schools in Rio, in South Africa, in London, in China, all over the world. But those were individual projects. And sort of for me, that wasn't changing the piece. So it was vital that we then used those exemplars, those case studies, those pilots, to really look at how you change policy. So working with you, taking those and working with UNESCO to change the physical PE guidelines that work across the world, working with the World Health Organization to look at how physical activity can be part of their wider policies that inform the way that cities think about their countries think about their cities and their designs, as well as their health structures, thinking about prevention as a health system rather than just treating illness. And so for Nike, it was really important that we were seen as a global player changing global policies. And for me, it was about taking the shift from an individual choice to a societal design piece, which is, very Durkheim, all our anthropological training begins to kick in at that point. But actually, the impact of that was then astonishing in terms of leveraging additional money into this, changing the way governments and city at a national level, international level, working with the European Commission on funding streams, for example. Changing all of that was a systemic change rather than just a project by project change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so often it seems like the way that governments approach this problem is to try to nudge individual choices, right? It's like subsidizing gym memberships and things like that, and make it about the individual rather than. It seems like what you're talking about is more kind of affordances, I suppose. It's like, well, how do you put things in place that people almost don't notice, but that make it easier for them to live a more active life?
Absolutely. Being more physically active benefits everybody in every way. If you could invent a drug as powerful as going for a walk, yeah, you would have Nobel Prizes up to your
Yeah.
armpits, reducing dementia, heart disease, cancer, breaking bones, any physical health piece. Then you factor in the mental health piece. Then you factor in the social community cohesion, interconnective tackling isolation. There's evidence that kids who are more active do better in school. People do better when they are active. But I don't know about you, but we're busy people. We live stressful, busy lives. The thought of adding yet another activity or thing into my life, oh God, I've got to go to the gym. Oh, I've got to do this. It's such a barrier. It's such a psychological barrier. God, how am I going to fit this in, or how am I going to afford this? But actually, getting off the bus stop earlier and walking that piece, walking to school with your kids, it is not just a beneficial, but it's enjoyable. It's fun. You make those social interactions, and then you get all those positive feedback loops happening. In my current job in London, we did a piece of work we used this sort of ethnographic diary approach, or flash ethnography, of challenging people to build 20 minutes of activity into their everyday lives and look at how they did it. And then we went back 6 months later and see how much of that was stuck with. And those people who had sort of, and literally, as I said, got off the bus earlier, decided to walk back a bit further from the tube station. They were the ones who that was the behavior that stuck. Yeah. And so I come back to the fact that this is a societal design piece. This is social. This is a policy. This is interacting policies coming together to help everybody. We all need to collectively design more physical activity into our daily lives. And I think that, for me, is the change from thinking about, oh my God, I've got to go to the gym, or I've got to join a swim club, or I've got to run a marathon. This is actually, building an extra 10-minute walk, or and changing an existing activity is so important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't see it. I won't turn the computer around in case I knock the microphone over, but I've got running kit drying on my bike behind here, because the way I do it is that I run into the office basically in the morning. So but then you're basically not using any time.
Absolutely. And I think, active commuting is a brilliant way of changing things. I was talking to a GP the other day who was talking about one of her patients who had was pre-diabetic, was a type 2 diabetes was sort of encroaching. And now it's very common, but I think a lot of people forget how damaging that can be to people's lives, and the impact that has. And this, her patient I think there was a tube strike, but I know there was a tube strike in 2021, and he had started walking from King's Cross into his job in the city rather than catching the bus or the underground. And that happened for 3 days in a row, and he quite liked it. He carried on going, came back. He was no longer pre-diabetic just because of that walk. So changing one of his bits of activity and doing that changed his life forever. And it is that simple of how you can shift those behaviors to really make an impact on people.
Yeah. I suppose that was almost a product of necessity then. The tube was on strike, so you kind of had to walk. It's kind of an
Well,
interesting.
I can't. There's nothing good about a tube strike. It does create for a lot of people. But if there's a silver lining to some of those dark, it is that.
Absolutely. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you faced as the Cycling and Walking Commissioner? I kind of hinted at the beginning with mentioning the Charlotte Gill piece. You do get quite a lot of flack from certain people, but what have been the main challenges in increasing the amounts of walking and physical activity in London, would you say?
I was I have to admit, I was pretty naive coming into this job. And I think, I did not think I would be getting death threats for trying to put in bike lanes where previously maybe someone had been killed or seriously injured. Like that. And, I think I was naive on just how sensitive it is to try and start changing a city. The job that I've been doing for the last 8 years is about saving lives. It's about getting people active. It's a two-pronged approach. It's about getting people more active for all the reasons we've benefited, but also for those people who are active, making sure that they're safe to do that. And the biggest barrier, all our research shows the biggest barrier for people being more active, more walking and cycling in the city is safety and the perceptions of being safe. So building infrastructure, building bike lanes, for example, is the only way we're going to get people to be both safer and more active. But building bike lanes we can't generate more space. It's not like we're suddenly going to build new roads in London or suddenly be able to knock down buildings to put them in. There is competition for that space. And the existing status quo is very much driven by motor vehicles, and tackling that begins to enter into all sorts of areas of culture wars, and this gets weaponized very quickly. You don't need to, you go online, have a look at a Twitter feed of anyone engaged in cycling or walking, or have a look at the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph on a regular basis. You can see how this creates huge political tensions. And so I was naive stumbling into this, and sort of I have as an anthropologist, as you'd expect, reflected on this, and transport impacts every single person every single day. It's one of the few sort of policy areas which really everybody's lives is shaped by transport individually. If less so the health service, it's there when you need it. The criminal justice system, clearly if hopefully most people don't have to get involved in that. Ditto some of the benefit systems, etc. They're there when you need them. Transport is there every single day, but it's not just a local issue, it's a personal issue. It deals with a sense of belonging. And that, we all know, is such a powerful emotion. So it's my journey to school. It's my journey to work. It's my journey home to see my kids. It's my house. It's my community, and changing a street by removing car parking or taking out a lane of traffic to put a lane for cars to put in a lane for bikes is a change to that sense of ownership and belonging, which people have had for over decades and decades acquiring that. So changing that is an emotive piece. It isn't just a technical piece, and you need all the evidence that shows that it won't impact on traffic and it benefits this and it brings all the benefits around it. And you need to be able to rebut the myths through data, but you also need to understand it at an emotional level, because it's that emotional level that makes it so politically charged. And that's why you get commentators like Charlotte Gill Guild sort of talking about this, weaponizing it as part of broader culture wars. And I was genuinely surprised just how hard it is to make some of these changes. But very thin, because of those challenges, you overcome them by working with communities, how you approach the way of doing things.
Yeah. I was talking to an anthropologist called Anand Pandian a couple of weeks ago for the podcast, and he's written a book about division in American life and how it's kind of engineered and how we can overcome it. And there's a chapter on car design and just the sheer size of cars and how that shifted over the last sort of 20 years in the States. And it's really interesting. The conversations he had with people were all about people's sense of vulnerability and therefore wanting to buy a larger and larger car to protect themselves. But there's obviously that's protecting one person, but endangering everybody else. And it seems like, I mean, that's an issue in the UK as well. Cars getting larger and larger. In Durham, the pavements are really narrow. And as cars get bigger and bigger, it's kind of dangerous to walk in some places. But it's about kind of shifting what people's ideas about safety are, I suppose, in many ways.
You look at the school run, when I was a kid in the 1970s, 80% of London's kids walked to school or went to school independently, which would have been largely walking, cycling. Now it's about 25%, because of this. And the thing that's changed is this predominance of the motor vehicle, and sadly that it is not safe. But ironically, exactly as you said, people feel unsafe, so they feel that they need to put their kids in a bigger and bigger vehicle, and therefore it's creating more danger, so more people feel like that, which creates more danger, and so we need to break that cycle. But that's really interesting that research is being done by an anthropologist in America. There's the social scientist Donald Appleyard did some work in San Francisco in the 1980s, looking at the role that traffic and cars were playing on social cohesion and social connectivity in neighborhoods. And you can see how neighborhoods with big which are car dominated, it breaks down that sense of social capital in those areas, which ultimately, it all sounds very technical, but that ultimately ends up with people not knowing their neighbors, people being lonely, people being vulnerable, and social isolation, which is a critical sort of policy challenge for anyone in a city. So we have, for decades, and so for the past 100 years, we have designed cars into our cities. And there is a huge industry that has spent millions on marketing the cars, tying it to a sense of freedom. But it's not just the advertising and the car industry, it's Hollywood, Thelma and Louise, born to be, heading out on the highway, road trips as this sense of a rite of passage for young people getting a driving license. It is so embedded in our culture over the last 100 years that it's not surprising that beginning to question that, beginning to think, actually, can we do things differently? Trying to break some of those vicious cycles that we've developed is therefore so challenging, and that's why some of these things are political dynamite.
Yeah, I really get what you're saying about this idea that if we can build physical activity more into everyday life, we also increase those kind of micro interactions that are so important to people's mental health. I really like that idea that if we can just I don't know, streamline things into people's lives more, there's so many benefits that could come of it.
Absolutely, and yet it's amazing. Design is a broad piece, and I don't mean just design with people sort of figuring out, on architects on a sketchboard. But there is social design, there is nudge behavior, there's all sorts of things. But it's not just about cars and transport. It's also, when you go into buildings, how hard it can be find the stairs sometimes. Go into a hotel, try and find the stairs to go up to the first floor can often be nigh on impossible. We sort of, we have designed physical activity out of our daily lives, and I go back to the health piece. I was talking to Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, the other day, and we were both saying that we have the health system is excellent at tackling people who are sick, but we need to do more on a prevention basis to prevent people getting ill, and then managing those long-term conditions in communities, and ensuring that people have got the ability to be more physically active, and that becomes a natural default choice. That becomes a social norm. Is absolutely vital. Otherwise, the NHS will go bankrupt, as will every other health system in the world, because it cannot they cannot cope with the demand that will be coming down the line in terms of chronic disease and all the other pieces that come with this. So this is an economic necessity. It affects economic productivity. It affects, but ultimately, I go back to that chap who was pre-diabetic. It stops the trauma and challenge and misery that comes with some of these conditions on individuals. So we've all got a collective responsibility to do this, but the answer is not just injections to make weight loss. The answer is not just, there is no magic pill, but there is a pretty good, it's not rocket science of going for a walk for a bit longer, getting off the bus stop earlier, walking back from the train station, switching, instead of driving your kids to school, walking to school. That in itself is about as good as a magic bullet as you could possibly get.
Yeah. Sometimes it can be as simple as going for a walk.
Exactly. And then maybe going for, and it's the gateway drug, once you've started going for a walk, you might bump into friends, and then, maybe try a bike ride if I feel fit enough, or maybe, start, as you said, you'll run to work. It's about how do we just enable people to be a little bit more active in their lives, and the outcomes are astonishing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Will. That was fascinating. Thank you for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Michael.
If you enjoyed this interview and want to hear more perspectives from the world of anthropology, head over to our website at theanthropologypodcast.com. Thanks for listening to the Anthropology Podcast, and until next time, take care of yourselves and those around you.